So I'm just going to talk about one project, and as I've already finished 20 minutes ago, I'll try and be brief. Okay, so it's just a story, and that's actually the end of the story. So that's a very postmodern thing to do, isn't it? Actually, start with the end. Okay, this is the story, and that title is not mine. It's actually the people of Hastings, their own title. A pier is it's a social and physical structure, and it's one that's dedicated to pleasure. No, I mean that's the point. It's designed in the context of a very British, I think, a very British phenomenon, which is about it's about eccentricity, it's about bad weather, and it's about romanticism. So the postcards in Hastings say things like, more than fishing happens on the end of the pier. And it was built in 1872 by an engineer with the genius name of Eugenius Birch. So his parents, blessed with both humour and ambition, gave this child a fantastic career of invention. And he was actually born in Shoreditch, a very impoverished background, and became one of the key engineers on the Calcutta to Delhi railway. So he devised things like the use of cast iron for screw piles to negate the need for working between tides. Digging holes between tides is obviously fool's errand. And he designed these screw piles and used things like inclined columns to counter the effect of the harshness of the sea environment on structures like piers, which were in their infancy at this time. But he went on to do, this was the first of 13 that he did. So I should say that it was a runaway success, and then it burnt down in 1910, and it was immediately rebuilt with a bigger deck. And this bigger deck meant bigger buildings, and the bigger pier became an extension of Old Hastings, which was a kind of medieval small fishing town with no harbour. They literally dragged the boats up and down the beach, and then it also represented, you can see in the photograph, the burgeoning 19th century development that was known as St Leonard's, and that was really a promenade and straightforward speculative development. A landing stage was attached to the seaward end of the pier and allowed people to take a steamship from this pier to others up and down the coast. And when the Second World War came, it was obvious to everybody that Germany would want to invade Britain up Hastings Pier. And so the middle section, you can see, was successfully removed, and the strategy worked. So the invasion was successfully averted, and the island nation was saved by this instinctive lack of infrastructure. So the second heyday of the pier was the 1960s, when Hastings hosted the best music in the UK, obviously apart from Dublin, because you had your man Van Morrison. This was the best place to hear music in the UK for at least a decade. It was sensationally hedonistic, and the pier was actually a special place. It was the site not only of experimental music, but social experiment, you could say, not to mention drugs. I mean, it was special because it wasn't subject to the rules of the land. I think that's the critical thing about piers. It wasn't just about walking on water. It was about not having to comply with the norms of the land. So believe me, more than fishing happened, and it's one of the starting points. I see it as one of the starting points for popular culture in the UK. Now, architecture is the barometer of economic decline, or one of them, and seaside architecture indicates that storm first. And a 2017 report which is analysis by the Social Market Foundation, a kind of think tank. It showed that Hastings is one of the 10 local authorities in Great Britain with the highest unemployment rate in the first quarter of last year. So the pier, by 2009, there was too much stuff, too little business, too little maintenance, too little commitment, and it really was an abandoned shanty town of commercialism. So really it was shoddy structures and silent slot machines. You know, it was owned by an offshore company registered in Panama by the also incredible name of Ravenclaw. And it's in this context that the RIBA held a competition to choose select an architect to save and to reinvent the pier. And then the incredible happened. The local community effectively, and backed by this Hastings Pier Trust, they started acting as though they already owned it. And they mounted a campaign to save the pier, and they asked the RIBA to find an architecture practice, as I already said. We applied, and literally simultaneous with that, this happened. Disaster struck, and this devastating fire tore through the whole structure and effectively melted it, given it was mostly steel. So two boys and one match, variously described either as an unfortunate accident or deliberate arson, but we'll not know. They were underage, got away with it, and the competition brief had to be rewritten. And I remember going for the interview, and it was literally a backdrop of the smouldering remains. Majority was destroyed, but I would say it only intensified the local spirit and the idea that in some way they were responsible for its reincarnation. And at that moment there was this idea that the palace at the end of the pier, which was a theatre, and the site of the fire, that palace should somehow reappear. The absent owner failed to respond to the council's repeated requests to fix what had become a dangerous structure, and the Pier Trust was simultaneously gathering momentum, and with dRMM, my practice, with us behind them, the confidence, with their confidence grew with our means to publicly fight for their beloved town icon. And we started really by rewriting the brief for the rebuild vision through a process simply of listening. And it really was a fantastic period. We as a practice, we just hijacked existing events that the town is always having. I mean, they're a town that love to dress up and have festivals and events and crazy parties, and we would just turn up and set up shop. And so we'd have a captive audience and a critical audience too. I mean, that was the best thing. So we listened to their stories about the pier's past, what they loved about it, what they missed, their hopes for its future, what it meant really. It wasn't about asking people what it should be or even what it could be, as in, please, design it. And I found this process fascinating because clearly many people had a great deal of affection for the pier. Many were even conceived there. And Oscar Wilde said, nostalgia is the bank holiday of cynicism. And at no point was there a kind of uprising of nostalgia over a practical desire to simply reinvent it. And I thought this was full of possibility. Needless to say, the pier had to be all things to all people. And whilst no one really argued for a ballroom anymore, or a theatre even, it had to be about fishing, had to be about skateboards, music, markets, parties, festivals, cinema, yoga, and this expectation to make a new iconic destination. That's the official tourist word for it. So how could a megastructure be rebuilt to deal both with fire and storms, which were happening even at the point of the participatory, dialogue, and worsening the condition of the pier? So how could one do this and anticipate the future? What could we reduce it to, and what least intervention would simultaneously offer the most pleasure and solicit further adaptation and reconfiguration? And a building wasn't the answer. Sometimes objects are good. Sometimes the spaces that where objects could go are better. So it became a serviced platform of possibilities, apparently empty but full of promise, despite the sight of a kind of reductive hedonism. Nevertheless, somewhere where you can be submerged in the elements. So we resisted the temptation to do a signature building at the end of the pier in favour of doing something much more useful and I think more long-lasting. And the restraint to this project is also its power, I think. By stepping back, you actually invite and empower people to occupy it. But we did have to be both poetic and practical, as the overwhelming majority of the budget went from deck down to the sea. So large sections of the pier's substructure had to be replaced, and about 90% of the superstructure. So of the £11.5 million, that is, it's probably about the same in euros now, isn't it? Of that 11.5, only 2.5 went on buildings, a ubiquitous visitor centre and cafe. I say ubiquitous because you have to do a visitor centre to get the lottery money. I'm actually dead against visitor centres. I think they're places where you, at best, use the toilet. But there was an obligation there, which we met. So we supported the Hastings Pier Charity every step of the way. And that meant public meetings, publicity, fundraising, securing funding from the Lottery Fund, and from other agencies such as Coastal Communities Grant. But the Trust's masterstroke and this impassioned community really was the best thing they did. They persuaded the local authority, with our help, but we weren't the ringleaders in this. We were the support act. They persuaded the local authority to buy the pier using a compulsory purchase order, and then, based on our analysis and proposals for a safe public structure, for the whole community of Hastings, they basically got the pier for £1 from the council. The council bought it from Ravenclaw for an undisclosed amount, £1.50. And then through crowdfunding, and this is the other great thing that the Trust organised, it really was the first time a UK charity had issued shares, and they effectively brought something which had been owned, by a private company, and always had been, in fairness. Most piers are. But was owned by an offshore company into local ownership. So effectively, they managed through crowdfunding online to raise over £500,000. That's by over 3,000 local stakeholders or shareholders. And that contributed to the running costs for the first year. Now, the design approach was obviously strategic and economic, given that most of the money had to go from the deck down. But I should explain the drawings because I never do that properly. Yeah, okay, I'll just point. Middle circle. Early sketch of an independent structure to support visitor centre that could occupy that slice of the pier that was removed during the war. Ironically, it was replaced after the war, but was the first to fail because on this pier, the older the material, the more likely it was to have survived. Modern steel corroded so quickly compared to the cast iron of the Victorian structure. So we sited the visitor centre literally on that gap, and on an independent structure, rather like a table standing directly on the beach. The distinction between old and new is super clear, but perhaps I should explain the building. It's literally a two-room barn-like box with a cross-passage plan where you can access toilets with a fantastic view, I must say, and a really good multi-purpose space. You know, on paper that's an exhibition space where you go indoors to look at photographs of the place you're actually in. And then on this side is a community classroom. But you know, and then the little shop and the kitchen. But this serves really as a platform so that by adding stairs to that flat roof, you get the most fantastic vantage point where not only do you see 360, but you see the pier as well. That's a really special viewing condition. I should say that the deliberate flexibility of the space was in order to try and generate revenue, so you can get married there and you can throw parties there, as of course my practice has. Then at one end is glazing for a panorama of Europe, and then at the other end the steps can double up as auditorium seating for an impromptu gig just happening on the pier. The project really was in part about discussions with all these stakeholders about the difference between repair and restoration and reinvention and avoidance, which is my favourite. I've always thought the best detail was the one avoided. And we made very good decisions, I think, in respect of the need, the absolute need for things. It seems like a lot of money, but on a 300-metre long megastructure, you know, it's easily spent, especially when you're trying to work between tides with very special contractors. So even things like not having bracing in certain bays because it wasn't necessary, given that there was bracing on either side of it, represented a big economy. And just having straightforward galvanized steel trusses to replicate the original were good decisions to make, as were having a very plain balustrade and not trying to recreate the listed cast iron balustrades or the original, more of which in a minute. So it's all about being practical and sustainable, the whole project, and selecting cross-laminated timber as the structural material for the visitor centre was for its lightness, speed of construction, and all of this is essential when you're working with the complications of bad weather as well as the 7-metre tide. Doing more with less included things like the glass undulating in order to resist wind pressure without needing any kind of steel bracing. It's just glass, butted, but still giving you a kind of horizon view, and also becoming seating. So it's everything had a kind of double purpose like that. It's not just about social sustainability, this project. It's very much about environmental sustainability. That's something that's quite, I mean, that's a kind of social responsibility that is global and long-term rather than local. So that extended to things like the cladding of the building, which you see there, is actually the old decking of the pier that didn't burn. So most of the pier burnt, but there was a large area next to the promenade where the fire brigade managed to put it out. And so the decking that we could salvage was reintegrated into the modern building. So this is really super modern and CNC based, factory based, computer numerically controlled construction combined with craft. So it's prefab with in situ local cladding. It's about reuse and recycling. It's about the avoidance of waste. That's something. Waste is obviously a huge enemy of our culture. It's about local workforce, and it's also about new actually made from old. So history and memory reconfigured. This is the only building that survived the fire, and it's an old pavilion called the Old Pavilion. And you can see the plan of the old pavilion at the top. Showed a very compartmentalized structure that turned out to be made of Victorian cardboard. And then at the bottom, what we did to it in order to make a very similar silhouette and identical roof, a zinc roof, but with an open plan that could support a new kind of restaurant and bar that would be leased to a local business. And then strapped onto the back of it are these very kind of simple service rucksacks, so that we could keep the ground floor free from subdividing for toilets and so on. I sound toilet obsessed. I'm sorry about that, but it's part of the subject matter. These nappies are attached to the back of the building in order to contain essential deposits. I should also add that they, of course, also use the old pier decking. We used it for cladding on both buildings and also for furniture. The new balustrade is worth talking about if you think that really a pier, if you choose to not really do any buildings on a massive pier, then other than what I've shown you, of course, then it's really all about the edge, and that's the one detail that matters more than anything. So, in order to try and satisfy the various demands of the rhythm of the building, or the structure rather, and the memory of what it was and how you use it, and what people expected of it, we made something that was, you could say it highlights those elements, but this time trying to incorporate light itself. So it's a simple system of steel flats which are welded at different angles, which doesn't cost you any more money. It's the same amount of material, just manipulated slightly as a kind of optical game, and corresponding with the rhythm of the previous balustrading of cast iron that obviously we couldn't afford to replicate even if we wanted to. So everything about the deck serves to give you the most direct enjoyment about being in the elements. It's a promenade to the sky, and it's also this phenomenon of walking on water that people enjoy so intensely. And one of my favourite comments in the book, of comments that visitors sometimes respond to, is it's the only pier I've been on where you can hear the sea, as I assume, as opposed to slot machines. So it's about views, it's about the horizon, that's UK versus Europe. It's about openness, it's about, a large free access public space where you can kind of see everything but not actually be overlooked, which is an interesting condition when something we're not used to. It offers shelter and places to sit, and also this vast expanse of open space that is both the deck and the sea as another kind of platform. The theme of contemplation is interesting on a pier because it is a collective space, but often there are times of the day and year where you can have it to yourself, and that's pretty special too. You know, it's covered in plaques of those who loved the pier and died, and I guess also commemorating those conceptions on the pier. So there's seating and eating, and there's working with local enterprise beyond the community of the Pier Trust, which became a charity during the course of the reconstruction. It's a 7-year project. This is working with a local enterprise who find work for people who've had drug problems or long-term unemployment, and they basically recycle local wood. And as we all know, the history of ruins in architecture is not to do with the weather so much as the history of theft. And you know, when you see castles semi-ruined, you just know that the missing stone is all in the farm next door. And it's like that with the pier. You know, we did a deal. The wood was disappearing fast into the town, and we did a deal with these guys so that they would actually use half of it to turn into pier furniture, and then the other half they could do with as they saw fit. So they made the same furniture and they sell it in their workshop, which I find a great pleasure in. So they did the straightforward tables with a bit of help from myself in proportioning them, and then I did the other curved bench just as a kind of side project, and they were happy to make that too. So we made as many as we could of each. So it can be social and it can be solo. It can be choirs singing sea shanties or those returning to their memories. It's about making new from old. As I said earlier, it's not the juxtaposition of new with old, as is the normal trope of architectural production. It's actually making a modern building from old materials as well as new materials. And the slide shows a little bit of how we did it with the engineered timber internally at the bottom of the drawing of each plan there, and then the new materials superimposed over timber insulation. And the drawings to the right show things like, rather than just a parapet railing on top of the visitor centre, it's also a seat so when you stand you look over the glass, and when you sit you're below the glass level out of the wind, and you can sit as a group and enjoy some kind of social occasion without being subject to the 90-mile-an-hour horizontal wind. This theme of embodied memory with future identity is not just manifest in the materiality of the building. You can see on the left there the scorched timber that we used according to its length. So the longer pieces went into furniture and the cladding of the toilets on the old pavilion, and the shorter lengths went into the cladding of the new pavilion, so we could use up as much as possible. And then interestingly, the charity just started making these bags because they're proud of it. This isn't the kind of branding of international finance. This is just local pride at work. And I thought that they just took that as a leitmotif, was really revealing about how involved they were in the project. And it works. At least it did. You know, over the first year there was a huge variety of events since it opened. It opened well, actually, it's not even a year. It opened last beginning of last year, effectively, and as with many capital projects, there is money for the capital expenditure, but there isn't money for running it. And I mentioned earlier they raised some money in order to operate it as a business by the sharehold scheme, but it wasn't enough. And at the moment, the future of the pier is in question. Not necessarily as a structure or as an accessible public space, but just as in who's going to run it or possibly even own it, and that's the thing that worries me. So the impossible happened, as in it got rebuilt, this incredible ruin. So that impossibility gave inspiration and confidence to a town that was on its knees, the kind of town where there's needles in every closed down shop doorway. And now this massive symbol of regeneration has had a catalyzing effect, and lots of pop-ups and things are starting. So that's a really great thing of it. It's not like gentrification of the town. It's like although of course that's happening too, London investors hanging around trying to buy buildings. But it's about local community initiatives, often being orchestrated by the same leaders of the trust come charity that we worked with. So local businesses are coming together. However, we're now at a threshold where the project is in doubt, as in it may have to be sold. It depends on the administrator, how imaginative they are about how to colonize the pier. So in an age, just to conclude then, in an age of Instagram image fetishization, or plankton even, this modest megastructure makes a case for simplicity and space. And not being a genius and being skeptical of that myth, I believe in collaboration. I think Hastings Pier defines it. And the lack of compromise is actually testament to the success of a recklessly public-spirited venture. They say every sin is a result of collaboration, and it's the only way to work. And we've wasted space magnificently. And it seems like nothing captures the imagination more than not doing an iconic building in favour of creating public space. Thank you.